welcome to episode 5 of Game On. I am your host, Todd Kerpelman, and with me today,
Krispy, Developer Relations.
Krispy Uccello. And we're here to talk to you today about game controllers. But first, we'll hit you with some news and updates from the Google Play Game Services side of things. First off, we have an official Stack Overflow tag. So yay! If you've got questions about achievements, leaderboard, cloud save, multiplayer, any of that, you can go to Stack Overflow and find us under the Google Play Games Services tag. Hopefully by the time this video comes up, this tag will be available. They're working on it. And you can start asking us questions there. We've got guys much smarter than me that are monitoring that tag, and they answer a lot of your questions. So go there if you've got a question about support on a specific platform. You know, pair it with like an Android or an iOS tag, and we'll try and answer your questions. Also, there's a great new feature on the Play Games Developer Console. It's the greatest feature that you've probably overlooked because it's like this tiny little link at the bottom, but it's the new Get Resources feature. So you got to check this out. This is from our sample game, the Type or Number Challenge. You'll notice I've got 6 achievements here, and I've got a couple leaderboards. And in the past, I had to kind of copy and paste all of those random strings, and half the time when I clicked on something to try and copy the string, it would take me into the details page, and it was really annoying. Well, now I can click on this little link here at the bottom, and this will bring up a dialog box where I have all the text I need ready to copy and paste into my Android application, or my iOS application, or my JavaScript application. And if none of these code samples exactly matches the way you're implementing your achievement and leaderboard strings, we also just have a plain old text version that you can copy and paste and run through a Python script or what have you. So for all of you that are implementing 200 achievements all at once, this should be a really big time saver. And we're really excited to have this out there. So check it out if you haven't seen it yet. It's the greatest new feature ever. Well, maybe not ever, but it's close. And so with that out of the way, let's get into game controllers on Android. I'm going to hand the clicker off to Krispy here.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing, because he's the expert.
I don't know if I'm an expert yet. I'm hoping to become one. And this is sort of that first foray into that. So I spend a lot of time with game controllers, working on the stuff that I work on, and I've had a slew of them cross my desk. And with that, this is sort of the first thing. What does it mean to support a game controller on Android? Because there's so many different devices, and they all choose slightly different ways of connecting to Android itself. A lot of them are either Bluetooth or USB. Those are typically the only options that you're going to have. But one interesting thing is when you're building an application that utilizes game controllers, you have to factor in that you're taking the user's ability to really touch a screen away from them. And this is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing in that it gives you that tactile feedback when you're manipulating the controls, pressing buttons, etc. It's something that doesn't require you to focus your attention on what you're touching. You can instead look somewhere else. So this is great for like Google TV, Android TV, anything that is far away from you that you can't really touch. But on the opposite side, you can't really input text that easily. So if there's a lot of input controls that would require keyboard input, that's not always there. So, the plus points I'll just summarize again. Physical feedback, sometimes haptic feedback with vibrators. Negative side, harder to input text, and there's a little bit more design work that has to go into your UI. But we're going to cover some more later on in the slides. So let's talk about where the APIs came from. In API level 12, we saw the introduction of a lot of the constants that were available for dipping into game controllers, understanding whether an input device is actually a joystick, or whether it has joysticks, whether it's a gamepad, whether it supports buttons. And this has all been available in the documentation since API level 12. There's a link on the slide right now. If you're new to game controllers, this is the place to start. There's a summary section that really details things like what to do with source class joystick and source class buttons and gamepads. It's a good primer. It's not going to tell you everything you need to do, but it's a good place to start to get ramped up on that material. Now, with API level 16, we saw even more game controller support added. And this is where you can actually tap into listening to connection and disconnection events. Previous to API level 16, you had to write your own broadcast listeners to tap into when a USB device was connected or disconnected. And you would also have to implement a Bluetooth event listener that would tell you whether a Bluetooth device had connected or not. You didn't have to write a lot of boilerplate code for all these applications. Now with API level 16, there's the input listener that you can take advantage of, and it's definitely a big win. So there's a lot of support already there for game controllers. So the two places you're going to want to look, API level 12, the link is on the screen, and API level 16, check those out.
I noticed the slide here says something about querying. What's that?
Querying is polling, polling of a sort to find out what devices are actually gamepads. One of the things that we'll talk about later on the slides is how to identify an input device, whether it's a keyboard or a pointer or a stylus or an actual gamepad. And querying is kind of an easy way of just getting the subset of input devices that you care about in that case. We'll cover the methods or some of the methods of detecting input devices without using the querying right now. I don't want to go too much into that API. All right. So moving along here. Oh, I'm scrolling the wrong thing. There we go. So, connecting controllers. This is sort of the first step in being able to use them. Phones and tablets, you're typically going to rely on a Bluetooth connection because it's really hard to plug a fat USB port into your Nexus device, I found anyway.
Yeah.
But on Android TV devices like Google TV, you can typically plug right into the USB port and take advantage of that, and you can leverage Bluetooth. So I think I'm kind of recommending Bluetooth here, but you shouldn't feel that you're limited to only using Bluetooth, especially if you want to target a living room console style gameplay for your users. So just quick short facts about where USB came from. It was like from 1994. There was a collaboration of a bunch of companies that got involved, and they created the USB standard, and that sort of evolved over the years to our micro standard that we see now. You're not going to find any game controllers that really connect with the micro USB spec. I haven't found any yet. I'd be interested if there were any, but we'll see. I'll just mention again, API level 16 introduced the ability to easily search and listen for connected and disconnected devices. And actually, before I forget, the button mappings, when you connect your game controllers, button mappings are a little weird if it's a non-HID or HID device sometimes. You can press the A button or the B button on your remote or on your gamepad, and it will act as the back button. So we'll talk about how you can fix that a little later on, but just be aware that when you first connect, even though you can navigate the home launcher with it, it might not have the expected behavior right out of the box. So it's good for applications, maybe not so good for home screen navigation.
Okay.
So let's talk about querying for game controllers.
Hey.
This might be a little small on the screen. I say that because even I'm having trouble reading this slide now, but I'll cover the basics here. What you want to do is you want to take the input device class, and you're going to ask it for, you're going to basically say, get all device IDs, and you'll get back an integer array of all the devices that are currently connected to the Android system, whether they're virtual or real. What you want to do then is actually iterate over all those device IDs and request, again, from the input device class, get device, and you're going to pass in the ID that you're currently iterating on. That will give you an input device object, and you can now start to ask that input device object about itself. And the key here for detecting game controllers is, in fact, to use device.getSource. So device is our input device object that we created. Get sources returns an integer value, which is actually a set of bitmaps, bitmask mapped values that create a large integer. You will logically AND those with an input device source class joystick. Effectively what you're doing there is you're filtering out all the other bits, and you're just looking at the one that's going to tell you, hey, this is a joystick device, or it's not. And if that returns non-zero, then it is a joystick device. That means there's an analog stick on it that is a joystick axis. From there, you're going to want to possibly check the ranges that are available for that joystick device. So we're going to look at that now.
Okay, actually, sorry. So going back, so
backside.
So I actually can't tell the device, like, are you a gamepad? I would say, hey, out of all the features that you have, do you have maybe a couple of joysticks and some buttons and some...
Exactly. You're going to take the get sources and you're going to ask it, yes, do you have the ability to provide me joystick input? Do you have the ability to provide me button input? Chances are, if it has a joystick, it's a gamepad.
Yeah, is there anything that would have a joystick that would not be a gamepad?
I've done a lot of tests with a lot of different input devices. I haven't come across any. It's entirely possible, but probably not the normal case.
What about like a stylus then? That would say I'm not a joystick.
The stylus does have axes based on the angle, but it's not classified as a game device. It won't register itself that way.
Gotcha. Okay.
So with our joystick identified, or the device having a joystick, we can go in further and ask that joystick what motion ranges it has. And this is useful for determining the number of axes that are available. So if you had a gamepad or like some sort of game input device that had 2 joysticks on it, it's going to have 8 axes right there. One for the vertical on each stick and one for the horizontal on each stick.
Okay.
Now, if it also had analog triggers on the left and right, those will also show up as axes, but single axes. So you could have a device, or maybe I did my math wrong.
Yeah, I was going to say, that would be 4 for the joysticks,
I doubled
and then
it up.
2 more for the triggers.
2 more for the triggers. I was jumping ahead of myself in my head.
That's okay.
So 6 axes in that case. And the thing that looks like a D-pad, actually, on game input devices, people think that it's a digital input, and it's not. It's actually a hat device with axes. So you get another 2 off of that.
So a D-pad looks like, basically, it looks like almost like an analog joystick, except that the numbers aren't really analog.
Right. You'll get while it returns its axes values as floats, it'll either be 0 or 1. You won't get any of the mill ranges, whereas the other more analog style inputs like the triggers and the game's joysticks will return an analog value range between 0 or -1 and 1. So that's just something to be aware of. So we check the motion ranges just to get a principal idea of how many axes are actually on this device. And from there, we want to take that information, we want to store it in a state. We want to create a class that allows us to know how many axes we have, the IDs of those axes, and the values associated with them. So I'm just showing really the skeleton of a state class here. You're going to want to extend that with things to process the axis input and normalize it and all that stuff. And we'll cover a bit of that as we go forward, but I just want to point out the critical things you want to store: number of axes, the axes values, and you're going to want to use probably a sparse array to store the number of keys that you encounter. The keys are actually the buttons. So these map as keys. I think it's a little weird, but buttons are keys.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like an Xbox 360 controller, for instance, I believe those buttons are actually analog. Is that true? And if I had something that was similar,
I'm actually not aware of that. I didn't know they were.
I could be totally wrong. That's what I vaguely remember.
Different manufacturers can do different things, and this just goes back to what I said earlier. There is so many different types of game controller inputs out there. It's really hard to know what they all are, which is why approaching the way Android has approached it is really good. It lets you query the device for what it's capable of, which lets you then determine if the device is capable of providing the right kind of input for your application or game.
Okay, so let's say I query a device. It's a kind of standard 2 analog joystick, a couple of triggers, and it says, oh, okay, I've got these 6 analog axes. How do I know like which 2, for instance, correspond to the joystick on the left?
So when you get an on-motion event, and we'll talk about some of this going forward, when you get a dispatch on-motion event from your activity class, the event object is either a motion event or a key input event. We'll ignore the key input event. So you get a motion event, and the event object itself has information about what input source on the device is providing that particular input event. So there's a couple of things you can check, whether it's a move action associated with a particular axis label. So back to the APIs I mentioned before, API level 12, introduced a whole bunch of constants that you can use to determine which axes it actually is on the device. So they all map to different constant values.
Gotcha. So, for instance, if looking at a controller, the analog controller on the left, those two axes generally correspond to constants like what, like move vertical and move horizontal?
It's actually
or?
axis underscore x, axis underscore y. Now, the one on the other side of the controller, if it's there, is typically labeled axes underscore rx or x. My memory is a little fuzzy on this, but it's labeled
so I got my
appropriately.
axes left, axes y, axes rx, and axes ry, basically.
Right, but it's not always guaranteed to be that way. You might actually end up in the case where that secondary joystick axis is labeled with a Z.
Okay.
So Z, X, Z, none of it is constant with game controllers, and so you have to do a bit of experimentation. My advice is to stick with some of the more established brands because you're going to get consistent behavior across them, more or less. But it's a bit of trial and error, and you will probably end up having to map a couple of different types of controllers and adjust what they're reporting their axes to be consistent with your game logic.
And the time to find that out is sort of on my very first kind of get move event from that gamepad.
Exactly, because you're not going to be able to determine everything on initial polling.
Okay.
Yet, but everything can be dealt with on those events. So one thing I want to point out, since we've talked about the state of the device and sort of storing it, you're going to want to probably figure out an abstraction where each player should be assigned a controller device and let that be consistent. As well, you want to let the users sort out whose controller is mapping to which player. So one concept I have for this, which I haven't implemented yet, but I've seen in certain games, is something along these lines where the game starts up and it's like, all right, which players are assigned to which controller? So you'd have a list of all the gamepad identified devices down one column and all the players along the top. And any device can sort of push these these controller things into the right player slot. And then that player could go ahead and configure their device to their preferences. So just something I want to point out. It's always a good idea to allow, if it's a multiplayer game, to allow the players to assign which controllers are which. Otherwise, they're having to physically switch it, and it's not a great user experience. Okay. Yeah. So now let's get back to what we were talking about before, the handling of events. So there's two methods you're going to want to override in your activity, and that is dispatch generic motion event and dispatch key event. My recommendation is whatever you're going to write for your logic to manage your input from a game controller, you're going to want to feed these motion events from your activity into that class. Don't try and deal with them necessarily in the activity because it'll just bloat your code, and it's not a good way to abstract, I think. So whenever there is an axis movement or a hat movement or an analog trigger, you're going to get the motion event. So anything that's analog will cause motion. Any button event will trigger the dispatch key event. And this is where you want to start to get into filtering. So you use the constants, again, look at API level 12 documentation on this, to sort out which mappings are actually to the keys you care about. And I'm not going to cover too much about establishing how to remap keys, but allow the user to reconfigure the layout of their device, another abstraction layer. So you're going to want to pass this off to something that manages the device state and then returns it back to whatever is going to use that state to then modify the player controllable objects in your application. So it looks something like this. So your dispatch key event, your dispatch generic motion event come into the activity. You're going to hand it off through whatever system to get the state back and use that to power your application. I want to point out a few things about analog joysticks. You will have to be aware of the dead zone. Not all joysticks center on 0. They're moved around a lot. They're mechanical things, and so they can get a little off, and it can report to the sensors. Luckily, we have this thing called the dead zone, usually by calling get flat on the motion range. This allows you to determine some sort of air tolerance when the joystick is sort of released and not being touched by the player. Use the motion range of the joystick to determine this stuff. So the ones you care about are get min, get max, and get flat, which I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. You'll have to normalize your axis values accordingly. So I actually have a bit of code here that shows this off. Pardon me. So if we want to process an axis, and we have some axis value that we've gotten from our input state or controller state object. So we have a motion range, we have the axis value. What we want to do is we want to get the absolute value of that axis value, and then we want to determine the dead zone, so we're going to go get flat. And then we want to determine if the absolute value is less than or equal to the dead zone. If it is, return 0. That means that it's actually within that range and we shouldn't do anything with this. Or if the axis value is greater than 0, we want to return the absolute value divided by the minimum range, which gives us a normalized value. If it's less than 0, we're going to do absolute value divided by maximum range.
So what do these numbers typically look like? Like, is get flat, so I'm assuming get min is a negative value?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So get min is typically -1.
Okay.
And get max is
typically positive 1.
Yes, but you can actually modify this. If you want to actually get out of, let's say, a method like this, you wanted to get some greater range. You want to expand it out so you're not dealing with decimals. You're instead dealing with integers, which is completely possible. You could add biases to your calculations here to actually spit out, 1,000 or 200 or,
And get flat here would probably look like, say, 0.05 or something like that.
Oh, I think it would look even smaller. It's like, it's usually like, from what I've seen, from what I played, it's like 0.02 or 0.0201. It's very small percentage. Because remember, the values we're dealing with here are -1 to 1, and 0 is supposed to be that absolute center. But it fluctuates a tiny bit. Not a great amount, but if there's a lot of wear and tear on the physical device, you might see greater values.
Okay.
So one more thing that I want to talk about here is just about the user experience. When you're designing applications and games that utilize digital input, and I'm going to steer away from the analogs for a minute because you're not really going to navigate around with that. Let's say using the hat or D-pad, don't punish your users. Provide layouts that are actually navigable and don't lead them into traps. So patterns that we found useful are using shelves. You might remember this from, or you might have seen this in things like Netflix, etc., where everything is stacked as a shelf and you can just go along. It allows you to jump down or jump up to get out of your current horizontal scroll. Because you might have gotten 100 units over and you want to get back to some menu item on the other side of the screen.
If I go down and up or something.
Yeah, that's your shortcut out, as opposed to having to scroll all the way back. And tabs can be utilized in this fashion to help a user jump between a lot of content. Lists, it's okay to use lists, but always provide the out. Allow the user to jump to the left or to the right as appropriate. And grid is always good. Grid it maps very well to D-pad, we find. So. One last thing, I think I mentioned it already, allow the user to remap the keys. This is important. Some people have preferences. Some people, when we're playing first-person shooters, prefer the inverted axis control, which means down is up and up is down.
Those people are crazy.
Well, what do you prefer to use?
I like
no
up
inverted control?
Yeah,
I like up is up too. We're getting the
what, you? That's crazy.
And allow the user to assign different controllers to different players, which we already covered. So at this point, we're going to do demo. So we'll just go to that now. All right, so we chose Cordy 2 here. I like this game because it is very responsive when using controllers. I had a lot of fun playing it on the TV. So on the first screen here, we've got an example of using focus to your advantage. So those little white...
yeah, if I move my gamepad left and right, it'll go back and forth between buy full game and choosing a level.
So this is a really good example of how to illustrate visual focus. And this goes to what I was talking about before when we were talking about the layouts and how not to trap the user, etc. So it's very important to orient the user when they're navigating with an analog stick or D-pad or hat. So we've got our little game intro piece here. Cordy's coming out. All right, let's jump through the text that comes up. So this is all being done with clicking on the button.
Right, you guys, we're full screen, so you can't see me. But listen, these are joystick noises. I'm really actually playing with the joystick.
So now,
gamepad.
Yeah, it feels very natural, almost like you're playing a console, really.
Yeah, I have to say this is
It's nice and smooth. You can actually double jump in this. There you go.
Look at that.
And you know, for me, playing platformers like this, it just makes all the difference to use a controller. You're not distracted by any on-screen touch needs. Even though the UI in this case is still showing some touch commands, you have the option to jump back on touchscreen, which is great.
Yeah, I have to say this is a lot more fun to control using a gamepad controller. It's I don't have to kind of look to see, you know, if my fingers are in the right place. I can kind of just feel that, and this just feels, for me, a lot more natural playing a platformer game like this.
Absolutely. And one thing that actually frustrates me a little bit about the on-screen controller simulators, and that's kind of what I call them, is just simulation of gamepads. Sometimes when there's garbage collection going on within the app or even on the platform, you can get some, you know, some lanky feedback from what you're touching and actually cause the game not to do what you intended it to do. I don't know if you've ever experienced that.
I have on occasion.
So, you know, just makes, for me anyway, the argument that all games really should try and strive and support game controllers in this way.
Sounds good. Yeah, you know, my only complaint here is I'm sure this maps to a gamepad button, but I don't know which one it is.
Yeah, actually, that's a good thing to point out. A lot of the on-screen instructions in a game should, if there is controller support, they should detect that the input is mostly coming from a controller and maybe adjust the instructions to map to the buttons. Mm-hmm. So I think, there you go, you figured it out.
There's the B button.
Yeah.
Whee! Look at that. There you go. All right.
So yeah, a great game to play with a controller. There's lots out there. A lot of the controller vendors highlight the apps that support their controllers in the market, and you should check it out for some examples.
Cool. All right, well, I could play this for the rest of the video, but I won't because we got some wrapping up to do.
All right, let's get back into it.
All right. All right, and so we've got some Q&A at the end. I actually had a couple questions that are not on here, so I'm going to improvise.
Oh yeah. Let's do some improv.
Well, so at the beginning, you mentioned, you talked about sort of there's two ways to connect, Bluetooth or USB. Mm-hmm. Does a developer need to care? Like, do I need to know how my device is connected?
If you're developing for Android on anything less than API level 16, you're going to care. Because, Android treats both USB and Bluetooth devices as just input devices. When it comes to monitoring their connections and disconnections, which is something you will have to do on anything lower than API level 16, you're going to have to write two broadcast listeners, one for the USB, one for Bluetooth. That's where the differentiation comes in.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, if I'm planning, I've got a high-end game, clearly only modern devices might work. Moving forward, maybe I don't have to care. If I want to reach the broadest range of customers as possible,
yeah.
Okay. Now I've seen some game controllers or gaming devices where essentially the controller is integrated right into the device.
I've seen a few of those myself.
Yes.
They're quite amazing.
How is that represented? And I guess, do I need to care about connected or disconnected? It'd be hard to disconnect a Shield controller without breaking it.
You're probably right.
Uh-huh.
If we think about other ones that are similar form factor, it all depends on how it's connected. If you're just targeting one device, I don't know how likely a case that would be. You're still going to have to detect the input device as being there. So that's a good question. I'm not quite sure what the right answer is there. You get a point for that one.
All right.
I would say just treat it like you would any other device. Don't assume that it's there. You're going to try and build your application, as you said before, for multiple devices and form factors. Don't make assumptions.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Fair enough. Moving forward, the world's going wireless. Do you think Bluetooth is basically going to be the standard?
I absolutely think so. If we just think about what it means to have wires, and I'm going to go back to TV because I'm a bit passionate about TV, mm-hmm. It really doesn't make sense to have a really long USB cable plugged into your TV or your set-top box while you're sitting on the couch. People trip over it. Yes, it provides a very clean signal, but it's at the expense of being tethered. So as we in our lives move around more and care about bringing our data with us and interoperability between devices, I think Bluetooth is only natural as the the de facto standard, if it's not already.
Is that going to be replaced by a new and improved standard?
I don't know. Do you know of a new standard?
No, but I figured if anyone knew.
I mean, who knows? It could be the internet is everywhere and just powers things.
Okay. Let's see. And then, so speaking of sort of modern game game controllers, there's been sort of some certainly in the news a lot about Android-powered gaming devices. I'm thinking like the Ouya and the Shield, and probably more in the future. If I'm a game developer, is there anything I need to know specifically about sort of developing for kind of this new generation of Android-powered game devices, or can I just sort of address them like normal controllers?
I'm going to answer it this way.
Okay.
First piece of advice, do not lock yourself into any vendor's APIs.
Okay.
That is a good way to shoot yourself in the foot. Now, there are reasons to do that if you have deals with a particular device, but it means you're going to limit yourself to just that device. A lot of these Android game consoles all share a lot of similar characteristics.
Okay.
They're usually boxes. They're usually boxes connected to televisions, and they usually have wireless controllers. And they all kind of have 4 buttons on the right hand, and they have an analog stick available on the left hand. Some of them have a second analog stick, and they usually have triggers. So if you've ever played with any one of the popular consoles out there, they kind of all look the same. Yeah.
Okay.
That said, what those keys map to for that device could be different. So I would say see if you can take a controller from one device and connect it to another one, and see if it actually gives you what you expect back on like what the axes names are and what the buttons are when those events come in.
All right. And finally, if I'm looking at all this and thinking, boy, this sounds like a lot of work, maybe there's a game engine that can do it all for me.
There are game engines.
Right.
I'm partial to a few myself. I mean, I haven't played with Unity that much, but I hear good things, and I've seen it around. libgdx is one of my favorites, and it does come with game controller support. It's an open source project. I've played with JMonkey Engine, which is also pretty good. If we were to think about web games just for a second, and I know it's a little weird to mention it, but if you load a web page on your Android device and you try and use a game controller, none of that ever works. I don't.
I've never tried, but I'll assume that.
So there's no good engines, is what I'm trying to say, that I've seen that support game controllers on a browser. Yeah.
But it seems like most modern game engines these days will have some type of controller support.
Absolutely. It's sort of essential for a game engine to provide game controller support. So if you're choosing one and it doesn't, maybe you want to question using that
Write them an angry letter.
Or, you know what, better yet, if it's an open source project, fix the problem, submit the code, patch it, make the internet and world a better place.
Oh, it's much better than an angry letter.
There's too many angry letters in the world.
That is true. I get them. All right, well, I think that just about wraps it up. Let me see, do we have anything else on our slides?
I think there's just one more.
That's right.
More. So, yeah, I guess we'll point out here, I'm in the process of writing a series of blog posts. I'm targeting about 5 different posts right now that really go in depth technically on all the stuff that we talked about today and a little bit more around the UX guidance. So keep an eye out for those. They should be out in the near future.
Where would I find these blog posts?
You would find them on the Android developers blog.
Okay. I sometimes read that.
I read that regularly.
All right.
I'm a fan.
All right. So people should just keep an eye out there, and they'll see your blog posts in the next week or two.
I don't know if it's going to be the next week or two. I want to make sure all the details are nailed down solid. I don't want to give anybody bad advice. So
all right.
Very soon.
I'm trying to hold you to a deadline.
I don't give.
Right.
You can't estimate things like that.
All right. So by the time this video is out, all 5 blog posts will be published and they'll be perfect. So
Todd's going to write them.
You heard it here first.
Thanks, Todd.
All right, well, cool. Thank you very much for joining us, internet audience. And thank you, Krispy,
My pleasure.
for providing some really excellent content this week.
Thanks.
And we will see you guys in a couple weeks. Bye.